We've been talking about growing tension between the North and the South for several decades, stemming even from the 1770s and 80s. We just finished talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the ensuing violence of quote-unquote bleeding Kansas. In 1856, there is another election, and by this point, the Whigs really don't exist anymore. The Whigs that were created or gained their strength from opposing Jackson, they have, in the last few elections, put forward candidates that really were poor choices, and they cease to exist at this point. From here on out, we really do have the two-party system that is still familiar to us today. For the Republicans, the candidate is John C. Fremont. And this is the same Fremont who we saw during the Mexican-American War, who was given the mandate to essentially go conquer California. As a Republican, this idea of free soil, free labor, free men, he does not like the idea of expanding slavery. And he is running against the Democrat James Buchanan. Buchanan, he prefers the idea of popular sovereignty as a way to figure out what will the slave territories be. So allowing the territories themselves, the states themselves, to choose to have an election and allow the people to decide whether these territories should allow slavery. Buchanan wins this election, and in his inaugural address, he does promise he will not run again. So he's saying, I will only serve for one term. And that this issue of territory is, quote, happily a matter of but little practical importance, because he believed that the Supreme Court was about to determine this issue, and he said he would, quote, cheerfully submit whatever this may be. But, and you know I love political cartoons. As you can see here, it's a little bit difficult to see, but James Buchanan was really sort of lambasted or made fun of because he just did whatever the Democratic Party told him to do. And at this point, there were many Democrats in the South. And what this cartoon is essentially saying, the Democratic platform, we talk about a party platform or the purpose of your political party. In this case, it is James Buchanan that he will be the platform on which slavery will continue to exist. So this is obviously a defamatory cartoon against Buchanan and his belief that this is a matter of little practical importance. Now, the decision that he is counting on to figure all of this out is the Dred Scott decision. This was delivered by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, and what was going on with this story is Dred Scott was a slave, and his master moves to Illinois, which was a free state. The family lives in Illinois for several years, so Dred Scott has the opportunity to marry a free black woman. He travels around, he has a family. And then when Dred Scott's owner moves back to the South, his owner argues that he should be allowed to take him back because he is property. What Dred Scott was arguing is that when they crossed that 3630 line, when they crossed into the North, that essentially he was a free man. When his slave owner took him to the North, that he was essentially a free man at that point. In Chief Justice Taney's decision, he's pretty much calling the Missouri Compromise of 1820 unconstitutional. He's saying that the federal government didn't have a right to restrict the movement of property. So he is very clearly saying that the slaves are property rather than people. And also that Dred Scott really had no basis of bringing this suit to a U.S. court because it's only for citizens. And in the eyes of Justice Taney, Dred Scott is not a citizen. He is merely property. What Justice Taney was hoping to establish was firmly that slavery was an institution of property and property owners, and that this would sort of clear up any of these sectional debates. Unfortunately, it makes it even worse. There are many states that decide to nullify the Supreme Court decision, saying they would never allow slavery within their borders, no matter what. So that they would even break away from the country if they were forced to do this. Now, with all of these changes, there is another economic crisis. The Panic of 1857, and it looks like we're having these almost every 20 years. This economic sort of dip is caused by a misunderstanding, or you might look at it as a misreporting of the banks. And what happens is we call it a run on the banks. When people start to worry about the value of their money, they're going to go to their bank and take out their money. And then the banks have even less power, and then people panic. But what happens is this is going to reduce the amount of food and goods that are being exported, which makes it ultimately worse. Through this, though, the agricultural of the South, which is not only trading with other states but with other countries, that remains relatively untouched. So they're going to continue to succeed. One of the most interesting things that you won't find in your textbook, but is a result or an impact of this Panic of 1857, is known as the Forgotten Revival. This is led by a man by the name of Jeremiah Lanphier. Starts in New York City. And as a result of this economic crisis, over 30,000 people in New York City alone lost their jobs. So you've got all of these people who are jobless, sort of wandering the streets. Then on top of that, you have this sort of ongoing tension about the issue of territorial expansion and about slavery. And so this was a really unsettling time for people. So Jeremiah Lanphier, he decides to just set up a lunchtime prayer meeting. It's going to start with once a week, Wednesdays, noon. And people were looking for hope. People were looking for a higher power to make sense of this crazy world. And within a year, there are thousands upon thousands of people who are attending various prayer meetings, especially throughout the North and New England. And it's estimated within a year and a half of that first prayer meeting, at least 1 million people became Christians. And that's when the population was less than 30 million people. So that's a huge number of Christians. It's called the Forgotten Revival. It's not really in any textbooks, but the important thing is, one, that in times of crisis, people look for answers. And they often will look to faith to try and understand the world around them. But the other thing is, by 1858 and 1859, you have a whole new crop of brand new Christians who are now looking at the world through this biblical lens. And they're going to start questioning, is slavery right? And so this is one interpretation, is that this forgotten revival in many ways sort of pushed this conflict into the forefront of many Americans' minds. Another event that is going to bring huge crowds, not necessarily to pray, but certainly to listen, are going to be the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were both running for the Illinois Senate seat. Now, Abraham Lincoln had previously been a representative in the House of Representatives, and Stephen Douglas was the incumbent, meaning he was already the senator. Remember, he is the senator who really wanted to pass that Kansas-Nebraska Act so he could build that railroad. Lincoln and Douglas decide to engage in a series of 7 debates in one in each of, or in many of the different districts in Illinois. And the purpose of this was to get the citizens to hear their opinions, to hear what they stood for. The format of these debates, and it's now called the Lincoln-Douglas format, which is used in debate tournaments still today. It starts out, the opener would have 1 hour, then the second person would speak for 1.5 hours, and then it would go back to the first person for another 30 minutes. And even though Lincoln did not win this election, he becomes very well known across Illinois, and eventually his reputation starts to spread across the other states. And in this, we start to get a sense of Lincoln's Republican ideas of free soil, free men, free labor, and especially the importance of the Union. Another event in 1859 is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, John Brown had been one of these guys who went specifically to Kansas after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. His purpose was to sort of vote in these elections and create it to be a free state. But he is a fanatic. He is a religious fanatic. And he and his sons, maybe you'll remember from the video we watched from Crash Course, he and his sons essentially massacre, it's called the Potawatomi Massacre, with these huge swords, people who were pro-slavery. So this guy is a little bit of a cuckoo. He did not lose that sort of cuckoo-ness. John Brown, he was set on the idea of abolishing slavery, and he got it into his head that he should try to foment or encourage a slave uprising. And he decides to target the town of Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now, the reason he does this is the United States Army had an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, a stockpile of weapons. And his plan is to take over this town in order to get the weapons, and then these weapons would be given out to runaway slaves, and the message of this rebellion would spread, and the slaves would rise up against their owners. The problem is the slaves don't rise up against their owners because John Brown never told them. And so in his fanaticism, he is not necessarily being logical. When the uprising begins and John Brown and his sons and a few other men take over the town, their plans are completely foiled. There is a standoff in sort of a barn, and the United States Army sends one of its best, Robert E. Lee, to put down this threat. And Brown is captured. He is put on a trial, and very quickly he's convicted of treason, and he is hanged. And he says, when he is about to be hanged, that he would have done it all again if only, or that it would be worth it if he brought the country closer to justice. And on the day he is hanged, church bells are rang throughout the North, sort of showing their respect for him, even though he is a fanatic. And we watched the video in class, and I loved that title of American Hero or America's First Terrorist. And this painting is created several years later. You can see he does look very fanatical. But many people consider that this is the moment where the Civil War, the violence of the Civil War, is now inevitable. We have these two sides who are willing to use violence in order to accomplish their goals. And while John Brown may have been a bit of a psycho or mentally not all there, we will see that the Civil War will be fought and run by people who believe that they are doing the right thing.